right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's DC CAP's QA Touch virtual series, QA Masterclass. In today's edition, we will be talking more about example mapping, which is a collaboration technique used by teams to create an understanding of the requirements with the product owner and the rest of the team. My name is Catherine. I'm the partner manager here at DC CAP. I'll be the host for the event today. As you may know, DC CAP, we are the parent company of QA Touch, our test management software solution. And then we also carry several other relevant products around e-commerce in customization with our product Productmize, integration solutions with our product Chloros, product information management with FlexiPIM, and feel free to visit dcap.com for more information about any of our products or services. During the upcoming session, also please do feel free to ask any questions whenever you might have any. You can add them in the QA tab or comment in the chat section whenever you would have any. We'll be making sure to keep track of those and answer any of them by the end of the sessions. So today we'll have the 6th edition of the Masterclass series, and we do have a great speaker for you. We will be hearing from Thomas Haver, international speaker and automation architect. Thomas is a test automation architect that leads a team of testers, ops engineers, and production support analysts in the adoption of DevOps practices. Previously, he led the enterprise automation support of 73 applications at Huntington National Bank that encompassed the testing and metrics and reporting and data management. Thomas has a background in physics and biophysics with over a decade spent in research, science, studying fluorescence, spectroscopy and microscopy before joining IT. Thank you again so much, and welcome to QA Touch Master Series.
Hey, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Definitely a tongue twister.
Yes. Thank you.
Molecular fluorescence spectroscopy and microscopy. Yeah, I trip over it as well. So I get added an extra layer of difficulty for you. So doing the requisite Zoom meeting. Can everyone see my screen? Can everyone hear me?
Yes, you are good. Thank you.
All right, just confirming with folks. So we have lots of custom hand-drawn images for you today. So doing things very special for you. So thank you to Example Mapping, the new 3 Amigos. As mentioned, my name is Thomas Haver. If after this session you'd like to reach out to me for further details, my Twitter account's CogsFun. You can also check out my team's website on DevOps and automation called Red Green Refactor. You know, as was mentioned, like I was a scientist for about a decade before I was convinced to join IT. I'm an avid board gamer. I own around 2,500 board games that take up an entire room of my house. I'm an evangelist for Ruby Cucumber, which led me further into those BDD practices that we will be learning more about today. And I have an adorable cartoon family here. It's my wife and 2 kids. So they love these cartoons. They put the stickers all over the place. So to learn about example mapping, we first have to learn about the core concepts of behavior-driven development. And you may notice that you're going to have a very thematic presentation today. So that is because one of the activities that I would do typically face-to-face is thematic as well for movies. In absence of us being face-to-face for this session, I will walk you through what one of those sessions would be like. So that way, if you wanted to conduct it virtually with your team, you're more than happy to. So for us to begin, we first have to start off with our common understanding of user stories. The convention that was originally credited to Rachel Davies and made more popular by Jeff Patton in user story mapping is as a type of user, I want some particular feature so that some benefit is received. An example implementation of that would be, as a bank customer, I want to view my current account balance so that I know my recent deposit went through. While it is useful to follow the sort of common set of standards for a team or across multiple teams in requirements writing, it can be difficult though, because some features that describe technology updates or UI changes or have the system as the actor are very difficult to sort of shoehorn into this template. And, even today, Jeff Patton says, like, you shouldn't be married to this sort of style. You should have a greater deal of flexibility in describing your work. So with that understanding, we move further into like the core of behavior-driven development, like us trying to establish a common standard for our team to practice or across multiple teams. So in BDD, you're trying to promote the requirements by usage of examples, by collaboration amongst team members who have disparate backgrounds. And in doing so, you want to end up reduce the cost of your rework that you have. This is a very simple flow chart for BDD in that if you're writing the stories with the executable specifications in mind, then you are actually able to automate those because each part of it is testable and ideally automatable. You can then execute those tests in sprint or within whatever project guideline if you're, say, in the verification phase of waterfall, and you build up the bank of test results that can be added to by new development. So you have the confidence going forward that as you add a new work, that you're not causing defects in your existing application. So this is an accumulative effect of us adopting this process. The other benefit that we have to writing specifications by example and turning them into automated scenarios is reducing the amount of writing and rewriting that has to be done. So think about the game of telephone that occurs between, say, the business partner, the stakeholder who's funding our actual project, to either that product owner or business analyst, the business analyst to the developer to the tester. We want to reduce, ideally, the amount of rework that has to occur through the rewrites. Our examples in BDD end up elaborating those requirements. Those examples also become our foundational tests. This is not the end state for all of our testing, but they represent the foundation. And our tests end up verifying the requirements. So instead of rewriting things a bunch of times, ideally we want to write it once and use it across the board, as in have it be our documentation and our project tracking tool that also are represented as automated tests that reflect the current state of the application. So what changes occur if we're adopting BDD practice to testing, since this is QA Touch after all? Well, I'm going to tell you what it is not. BDD does not replace regular testing activities. Again, it's just that foundation that we start with. It's not going to define how testing should be performed on the team either. It does provide those guidelines about testing in an agile environment. And the focus for us is to ensure that defects are not added to begin with. Because we have the context of multiple team members providing their insight into the requirements writing process, we identify before we start work on that actual story any issues we may have, discussions that need to occur, blockers that may exist, or dependencies. So it's important that testers are involved in those requirements discussions up front to help prevent those bugs. Oftentimes BDD is thought of as sort of like a comparable to test-driven development, where in TDD, you write a failing test, you make the test pass, and then you refactor it to improve the state of your code. BDD follows a similar sort of set of guidelines that you come up with a failing feature, as in a feature that hasn't been implemented yet, with those executable specifications and the acceptance criteria. You then implement just enough code to make that feature pass, and then you refactor it. And this involves the refactoring of your actual automated tests as well. So the cycle is sort of linked together. Another benefit of us adopting BDD is that it encourages that collaboration. We want all the roles on the team to actually work together and balance each other out. Like, this will allow us to identify those issues upfront as early as possible. Oftentimes in our community, people keep on saying, we need to shift testing left, shift testing left. Well, like, this is one of the ways to do it. If you involve QA in the requirements writing processes and upfront, you can call out a lot of those concerns that would be tossed over the line to you downstream. So if we go back to our first example where we're using the template for user stories, as a type of user, I want some particular feature so that some benefit is received. We can start to write our executable specifications in a similar format with so-called Gherkin scenarios. Most of us are familiar with it now, of the given, when, then format. So given some initial context, when an event occurs, then ensure some outcome. The purpose behind writing our executable specifications in this business readable language is that you make it available to everyone on the team, not just those who are adept at coding. You want to make sure your product owner or business analyst who may never have coded a line in their life to understand this as well. So it's about that shared understanding. So using this template format is also an easy way to set up, well, what is our change of state? What is our expected result in a testable format? So in this way, Gherkin, as a style of us writing our executable specifications, our tests, is an effective way to communicate and establish a common set of standards. So as I mentioned, like, we're going to write it in plain language. Then our actual tests become living documentation. It represents the current state of the application. So as we modify our applications and add in new features, those executable specifications, those scenarios, represent the user experience. And if things change, you modify or remove features within your application, those go away. So that way you always keep up to date. You always represent the living documentation in the form of your tests. So that's the ideal form of documentation, especially for anyone who needs to be onboarded into your team to know what exactly the application does. So as I mentioned, like in the typical face-to-face section that I would have here, I would conduct several group activities. Now, obviously, like we're doing a remote webinar, it makes it more difficult. So I'm going to show you something that's been done live, as well as provide a path forward for you to do this remotely with your own team. So we're going to do rules and examples with a blockbuster movie. So I'm moving this completely out of IT here. I want us to get us out of sort of like our common safe space and go into a different realm. So we have a user story here. As a big time Hollywood movie executive, I want to create the next blockbuster movie in order to make a lot of money. So that is our user story. So we're going completely outside of IT. So in a session that I would host by this, it would be a user story, and I would have the folks attending the session form up into groups. What I would have the groups do is, in secret, write 3 rules for a blockbuster movie. Not to share with the others. The sample rule that I provide here is, say, a comic book character is featured. That is one of my requirements or rules. Hey, look, here's Thanos. So that would be an example of the rule that I had of a comic book character is featured. After the groups write their business rules, they then create 3 examples that illustrate your rules. So for instance, the movie is released on the July 4th weekend is an example that illustrates the rule must release on a holiday. Another example, Will Smith starring alongside aliens may represent the rule must star a big name Hollywood actor. So it's important to have both rules and examples. The step forward after the groups create the 3 examples to illustrate their rules is to share their examples with the other group. The other group then has the ability to guess the rules, and by doing so, they can create new examples, and they can simply ask the others, is this a valid example or not? Yes or no? And so you continue coming up with new examples, similar to the game of 20 questions if you've ever played that as a kid, trying to understand what the business rules are. The sort of gap that you have in not knowing what the rules are is a representation of the gap that we have in our development. We may not know what our ultimate customer wants. We may not know what our stakeholder ultimately wants because they're separated from us. They're not embedded within the team space. At the end, we take a look at how many examples did it actually take to guess the rules correctly. Some teams can do it very quickly. They can do it with just those 3 initial examples. Others require many more, going back and forth and asking more questions in the form of creating these examples before they can answer it. So here's a sample one, where again, we use this. The movie is released on the July 4th weekend. That illustrates the rule must release on a holiday. Robert Downey Jr. is the lead actor, is our next example. And that illustrates the rule must feature an established Hollywood star. And last one to get a little bit meta, since you have Deadpool here. Deadpool kills Ryan Reynolds before he can star in the Green Lantern. That's an example for the rule is the movie breaks the 4th wall, which is something that actually happened in the Deadpool movie. So Deadpool is played by Ryan Reynolds, and in the movie, he kills the actor Ryan Reynolds to break the fourth wall. So it's important to actually have both rules and examples. Just simply having requirements that are only set up from the technical standpoint without showing you how it's actually going to function live from the user's perspective is challenging. So you need both rules and examples to help understand the full scope of a user story, with those examples becoming our test cases. So our process is we start off with that sort of high level, like what is our user story? And that user story should ideally be focused enough so the team can actually deliver it within the time period they're given, whether it's like a 2-week sprint or a month sprint. You create the rules and acceptance criteria from that user story next. These are the bounds that we're going to follow. This is the business logic to be implemented. And based upon those rules, you create examples to illustrate those rules. So let's talk a little bit about examples. I gave several of them as a Hollywood movie. However, we have to understand that from the IT perspective, that examples can come in many different forms. They could be input-output data pairs, they could be sketches of the user interface, they could be a bulleted list of different steps in the workflow, or an Excel workbook. So it can take many forms. It doesn't have to be something that's purely written down on a note card. So the important thing with those examples, though, is that they should combine the context, an action, and an outcome, similar to our given, when, then. Also similar, if you're thinking about it from the perspective of a developer, to arrange, act, and assert, which is the same format that is used for unit testing. So in this way, we're trying to, as we go from either the most minute level, which is the unit testing, up to the high level of our story, we're all following sort of the same format of context, action, and outcome. So some of those examples formulated into scenarios when a user's story is ready. BDD tools that are readily available can turn those into tests before the behavior has been implemented. This is our BDD format. We create a failing feature, we implement the code, and that feature then should pass. Two examples that are available are SpecFlow and Cucumber. SpecFlow, of course, used primarily with .NET, and Cucumber has been implemented in many different formats as well. The whole point of these tools is to exist at that locus of executable specifications, automated tests, and living documentation. So instead of writing it 3 times, you write it once and it represents all 3 of those. So this is just a way to make it easier for you to write those executable specifications. So this presentation is about example mapping. So now I provided you that context, we're going to actually dive into an example map. So it's important to note when we start off with that user story, we need to follow the 3 C's. The 3 C's being card, conversation, and confirmation. The card is where we write the user story. It shouldn't contain all of the information we needed in the requirement. It's just enough to identify what's needed. The important point is the card is a token. It represents the requirement. It's a promise that you're going to have a conversation. The conversation is the exchange of ideas and opinions between members of the team. And this is why we say it's the new 3 Amigos. When you say 3 Amigos, that could be your tester, your developer, and business analyst. Or in some cases, you replace the business analyst with the product owner. So similar vein here of you're going to have that exchange of ideas between people who represent different roles on the team. And that conversation will take place over time, and it should ideally be verbal. I'm sure we've all experienced, especially now working remote probably for the last 6 months, that tone is not necessarily conveyed effectively via email. So having Zoom meetings like this or WebEx, is a better way to communicate with people and understand. You want to have those same conversations verbally over those user stories. The last piece that is important to maintain is the confirmation. For anything that you're planning to deliver from the standpoint of you're putting in features, you need to have an acceptance test associated with that to actually confirm that you have delivered what you set up to do. That confirmation we typically call our executable specifications. So This is a way for us to follow that end user behavior to confirm that we actually met our requirements. Without that, we're really challenged. So our conversation that we're going to have is a so-called structured conversation. And that's what you conduct in example mapping as well. That's the exchange of ideas between a facilitator. Some ground rules that you should maintain in hosting one of these sessions on your teams. It should be collaborative. So that means all attendees participate actively. No sort of silent participants. You have diverse perspectives, so you represent all areas on the team. It should be short. I recommend a time box of 30 minutes or less. Progressive. You're going to capture the work as you go. You're not going to say, well, we'll wrap up and take notes afterwards. You take the notes live during the session. And then lastly, consensus. Consensus means that you have the examples and everyone agrees of whether that story is ready or it needs additional work, additional sessions for it to be ready for the team to work on. So following these guidelines are going to help you be successful in conducting a session. There are many other terms, or forms of these refinement activities. So some people call it a specification workshop or a discovery workshop or a tasking session. The important point of whatever you call it and whatever your practices are is that you actually do it regularly. Your team adheres to this working agreement. I have listed here on the bottom some additional background materials, if you want to learn more about conducting these types of sessions. For us specifically in example mapping, it fits in very nicely. It's intended as a practice for a team with BDD. And BDD core components being discovery, formulation, and automation. Example mapping itself helps fulfill the discovery component of BDD. Here is our example map. Our example map starts with a single user story placed at the top. You have represented in that session those core members of the team: product owner, business analyst, developer, tester. Underneath the single user story you're focused on, you'll have your blue business rules. These are the business logic that the developers intend to implement. For each rule, you're going to have one or more examples that will illustrate those rules. These can be equivalent to the scenario names you're coming up with for your test cases. Additionally, if you have questions and no one in the room can answer them, you capture those on these red cards. So process again is single user story is the focus of an example mapping session. No multiple stories, just one story per session. Acceptance criteria written on those blue rules. You can have as many as you want, but you'll understand shortly here why we use this color coding. And examples. You should have at least one. You should never have a rule without an example, because how are you going to actually validate the business logic otherwise? And then of course those questions. So anything, whether it's, hey, I don't know what our third-party service that we're going to implement with, allows us to do this. All right, we need to go talk to them. Or I don't know if we're going to adhere to security standards. We need to go talk to InfoSec or go talk to an architect. Or maybe I just need to go back to the stakeholder because I'm not clear. Did they intend this to be implemented for, say, our web application or also for our mobile? You're going to continue this session until the time box is met or everyone believes the story is elaborated. I recommend, say, 30-minute sessions, and at the end of it, you do a simple thumbs up, thumbs down by everyone on the team. As long as one person gives a thumbs down, that story is not ready. So in this way, it serves as a great form of feedback. It allows the team to accept or reject the story that they feel is not ready. And it helps out the team actually deliver on what they set up to do. So if you have a story that's not ready and you begin work on it, you're going to run into trouble more than likely. So looking at that example map, why color coded? Well, if you have a lot of red question cards, that is a good indication that development work is not ready to begin. Thumbs down. Go answer those questions separately and then come back and host another session. If you have too many blue business rules, that's an indication that that user's story is too large. Again, you will need to break that user's story into 2 or more, split it up, and continue your session focused on just a single user story of those groupings. If you have too many examples underneath a business rule, that is a good indication that the rule might be too dense. and you need to break the rule apart into 2 or more rules. So this is why we use the color coding, and you get that visual representation. If it starts to look very wide because of the number of rules, good indication the story is too dense. If it looks very deep, as in too many examples, that's an indication the rules are way too dense and need to be broken apart. If you're littered with red, that is your red flag that the story is not ready. I'm not going to attach for you or give you recommendations on like the exact number, say like if you have more than 5 rules, this is a story that needs to be broken up. It's more about your team's understanding and working agreement of this feels too large for us, or this rule is too dense for us to accomplish. And I'll show you an example shortly. So why actually conduct example mapping over, say, some of these other types of sessions? Well, the shared understanding is important. That's part of BDD. Your examples immediately become your user scenarios that should become automated tests. Those rules are things that your developers take, that's your business logic that you implement. Those are your acceptance criteria. And because you provide the team the avenue to break apart those large stories or stories that are unclear, you reduce the amount of rework the teams have to do. So all of these benefits are part of behavior-driven development. So let me provide you an example map. We'll get super meta. Hold a virtual webinar. So what are some rules I would have associated with the webinar? The presentation must be stored in an accessible location. The speaker must have a machine capable of audiovisual. Webinar must have the means to record the presentation. So what are some examples that I can give for each one of these rules? I could say SlideShare is valid and YouTube is valid for our presentation stored in an accessible location. Those are examples that illustrate the rule. For the speaker, must have a machine capable of AV. I say Lenovo ThinkPad has a built-in speaker microphone. MacBook Pro has a built-in speaker microphone. Those are examples that illustrate the rule. And lastly, for the webinar, must have the means to record the presentation. GoToMeeting is certainly valid. I haven't listed here. Zoom is valid. You can also go in the negative. You don't always have to be positive for your rules. Confide is not valid. Confide by its own design does not allow you to record presentations. We could have additional questions that would come up during a session of how do you address hands-on activities virtually? In this case, I'm showing you examples for it. Will the session be live for attendees? Yes, it will be. Will the session be edited afterwards? We just got the answer before we even began here. And will the recorded presentation only be available to registered attendees? So these are some questions that the group could come up with to go ask their stakeholders. Right, having shown our example, here's a few words of caution for you. So one person who ends up writing out those scenarios while everyone else is sort of sitting there or waiting by is not an effective use of time. Those examples should just become your initial starting point and represent the scenario names. Don't allow the team to fall into the trap that the examples are the only testing that needs to be confirmed. Again, this is not a replacement for your testing. This is establishing those foundational tests that you care about that illustrate the business rules. And lastly, if you're looking to adopt this on your team, teams are going to be resistant to change for any practice, even if it's a positive practice. So what I recommend you doing is identify, say, a small initiative that you could use as a POC, or a single team that would like to adopt it for a sprint, and conduct those sessions. Collect the feedback from the team members about the practice, and then decide if you want to expand on it. You know, it's always best to empower the teams to adopt any new practice, especially one such as this. I also have some words of advice for you. So if you're going to write examples, it's very challenging to do so. Like you'll see when we get into the session that people often have difficulty coming up with good examples. So examples should be brief. Use business language, so things that the team will understand. Use real data, help to discover white spots and requirements. Intention revealing, a way to describe the test by focusing on what we wanted to achieve and not how. Essential, only include those relevant details to the scenario. And focused, the scenario should illustrate a single rule only. So you have an additional item in here that you may have spotted when I was talking about the Hollywood blockbuster movies. You know, I mentioned one of the rules is must release on a holiday. The example I gave was July 4th. That does mean something to folks in the United States. outside of the United States, that doesn't mean something to everyone else. So think about that limitation of the context I provided. So I said July 4th weekend, that's great, but for everyone else in the world, it doesn't mean whole much. So context does matter. So I mentioned like one of the challenges is an example that illustrates multiple rules. So I have the movies released on the July 4th weekend, as I mentioned. Well, if we have a rule that must release on a holiday and we have another rule that must release during the summer, in this case, my example can be used for either rule. That can make it difficult when we're talking about implementation of confirming those individual rules. So we end up needing to split those examples and be as specific as possible. So must release on a holiday, well, what sort of holidays can we choose on here? I mean, it again depends upon the context. So you could have a example that would instead choose a different holiday. We could still go within like the United States, say like Memorial Day being one of those, or Halloween, or President's Day, MLK Day, and that would illustrate the must release on a holiday. And you would have a separate one, must release during the summer, of an example of like, is released during the month of July, is released during the month of August. And again, we go with context for where you are in the world does matter. So summer in the Northern Hemisphere is different from summer in the Southern Hemisphere. So those sorts of things are important to keep in mind when we're talking about actual technical implementation. The context instead we're thinking about is our users, what sort of like operating systems, devices that they are on, what context, what different types of users they are. These are the things to bring up during these example mapping sessions. So I'm going to show for you a remote example mapping session. So understanding that things have changed and all of us are working remotely, or most of us are working remotely, that I conducted an example mapping session with one of my teams at the very beginning of the pandemic, and this is an illustration of that example mapping session. So if you wanted to conduct it, you need to make some modifications. One of those is focus on those rules and examples. Same as what you do face-to-face. You need to have a facilitator who keeps the meeting going. So someone who's sharing their screen, and talking us through it, similar to what I'm doing. You need to collect results in a format that all team members can understand. And capture those questions that block the discussion and make them visible to everyone. Ideally, like we're all familiar with project tracking tools, whether you're using Azure DevOps or you're using Jira or using Trello, you want to capture those questions within those stories so it's visible for everyone. You also need to provide an easy way to have an overview of what was already discussed. So making it visible, transparent for all. And you should have those shared notes at the end of a session. Fortunately, there are a lot of tools available for us to do so. One of those is Cardboarded. It's a free-form canvas where you can actually have those virtual note cards. It's a great way to collaboratively work, to share with other members of the team live, capture everything you need. Another form is Miro. Miro has a lot of different canvases. If you want to do, say, even user story mapping, they have that available for you. And it also can use note cards, and it's a collaborative where multiple people can work on it at the same time. And if you don't want to go use any one of those services, think about like the very easy. I could open up an Excel sheet, share my screen, and we can do an example mapping on Excel or Google Sheets. Perfectly fine and available. Sort of whatever fits your need as a way to just capture that data. So as I mentioned, we went through a group activity. This is also typically where I would come up with sample user stories for everyone in the session and have them create an example map on their own, understanding that we are working remote here. Instead, I'm going to walk you through an example mapping session that a prior team had conducted. So the story is, as a customer, I want the ability to create a VIP membership account directly from the shopping bag page, so I do not lose my place on the website. And because this is the first time all of you are seeing this, let me provide some additional background context for you. So right now, this is an online e-commerce site. Anonymous customers in the shopping bag who want to check out will sign up as new members. In doing so, they end up navigating away from the shopping bag page. They want to update to add functionality so people can sign up on the shopping bag page, because analytics team found that if people leave the shopping bag page, they're less likely to come back to it and actually check out. So e-commerce, getting those sales are very important. So making it as easy as possible for customers to sign up and check out is an ideal state. So I conducted this session with 3 members of the team that I was working with. And so this is their own live results that they had. So working on Cardboard It, they started with that single user story written on a yellow card. So there we go. We have the as a customer, I want to build a create a VIP membership account directly from the shopping bag page. They began to write rules from that user story. So in an ideal state, you want to avoid UI. You want to avoid the how they're accomplishing it, because you could have different sort of paths to accomplish the same thing. You want to focus on like what they are accomplishing and why they're accomplishing, that user experience focus. You want to avoid the dense rules that are unclear. Here's a great example of a super dense rule. Customer must provide full name, email, password, and full address. That's a rule. Diving deeper into that, think about all the different validations that occur on an email or password rules or address. So that's an indication of a rule that should be split. And they ended up ultimately splitting that out as they talked about the density of that rule. So you can break that dense rule into 2 or more rules and reveal additional critical information about the story. So that's what they did. They broke apart this very dense rule into a couple of other ones. So we'll talk about the items on the left first. So this is where it was brought up by a member of the team of the address is actually verified by United States Postal Service. And they additionally automatically associate city and state with a zip code that's entered for their address. So this has been broken apart into areas that teasing out those rules that we didn't quite know at the forefront when we just say, hey, customer must provide full name, email, password, and full address. Additionally, you have great challenges. I mean, I would say an entire user story could just be around building out email validation or password validation. So how do you capture that in rule format? One of the easy way outs that I have teams do is if there's already existing formats or existing implementations, so that's the shared understanding the team already has, then it's quite all right to just say email must fit company required format. So if you have a reference to it, then it's quite all right. Just like I explained, your examples, they could be input-output pairs, they could be an Excel sheet or an image. So too with rules, can you reference company standards or industry standards as long as that documentation is readily available? So stories with a bunch of rules should be split apart into 2 or more. We can already see, just looking at the slide I'm showing you here, this story is getting pretty wide. So here's another item to be concerned about. They added in the customer can optionally add their birthday, gender, and phone. Similar issue of customer must provide full name, email, and full address. The difference is one is required, the one is optional. So you may end up having to break apart that depending upon all the form field validation you would have. From the rules, they began creating examples under each business rule. We'll talk about some of these that I'm going to specifically highlight. So the first one is right down the middle of the line. The customer can sign up from the shopping bag. That is our rule. What did we illustrate it with? A customer with an empty shopping bag has the option to sign up. A customer with at least one item in the shopping bag has the option to sign up. A customer cannot have the option to sign up from clearance. So both positive and negative examples. So that is good. Trying to use some of the tester sort of rule of thumbs of 0, 1, or many in the examples as well. So that's great. But there's some challenges with that. Like they're not saying necessarily what type of customer this is or providing other examples of like what potentially they would be shopping for or an item that's out of stock. So there's other items to be concerned about here. Similar with the email must fit company required format. One of the habits that people will fall into when doing an example map is to try to come up with as many examples as possible and trying to be like all encompassing. That's not the intent of example map. It's about establishing a shared understanding. So you just need to have enough examples to be representative of that rule and not include every single edge case. Again, this is not the end all be all of testing. It is your foundation. So including things like you're requiring the @ in there, or you have an example acceptable domain. Like, this is perfectly fine as a starting point for testing. This is enough so the team can understand what needs to be actually implemented. Similar thing with password. You just need to have enough to indicate that this is valid or invalid. Examples to illustrate the rule, not all the examples in the world. And lastly, this is a rule that could have a jillion examples associated with it. So how do you actually illustrate all of those rules? Well, one, you likely break this rule up into many different component rules, or break it off into their own stories. But you need to still have some illustration of a customer, say, successfully signing up, including the optional information, or not doing so. So in this way, you could end up using several representative examples for each card of, well, they're putting in optional information. That isn't enough just to say that. That isn't actually a good example. You need to say their birthday is January 31st, 1979. Their gender is female. Their phone number is, 367, 125, 3579. So you would actually include those examples that represent, not just have a statement. The example that's provided on that far right is closer to a rule, or without providing anything else. The team at the end of the session ended up having a number of questions that no one in the workshop could answer. Things such as, the sign up, it should be visible, to cookied customers, yes or no. They didn't know this answer yet. The first and last name, should it accept special characters? There's a habit when you're doing validation for first and last names to ignore people that say have accents in their character and in their names. Is the address required? So on become a member, it's required, and in another place in checkout, it's actually not. So this actually helped identify an issue with prior implementation on this web application. And they asked questions, will the sign up have a different experience across device types? That wasn't something that was necessarily even considered when coming through the business. Like tablet, phone, web, going to be implemented for the mobile application as well. And other questions like, we had a lot of examples for the United States. This is a company that also operated in Canada as well. So will it accept international addresses, military addresses? These are important things. So at the end of the session, the team decided the story is way too dense and it needed to be split up into multiple stories. And there are too many open questions for them to feel confident about starting it without having to do a whole bunch of rework. If the story entered the team space, the team would be set up for failure, not success. So it's better to reject it, get those answers, split the story, and continue. So this is an important point for you to take away. Sometimes it takes multiple sessions for that story to become ready, for the team to give it the thumbs up. It's okay to split the story. It's okay to have multiple sessions where you're teasing out the details. You're doing it as a group, so you understand what actually needs to be done. So when it's actually in that ready state, the team can actually be successful and implement it. So everyone in this session voted thumbs down on this. Story's not ready, so they take it back, answer the questions from stakeholders or architects, and then come back with the split story and continue on with a separate session. So that's our example map. So another area of concern that I will typically get as a question when trying to implement a process change is like measurement of progress or measurement of success. So how do we know that our change has led to improvement? So one of those changes that you can measure is % business rule. I didn't tell you up front that there is going to be math in here, so I apologize for those of you who are upset by it. Just a couple of metrics though. So our % business rule is the % of business rules covered with specifications, our test cases for regression or release or deployment. And so this is a way for us to confirm that for each rule that we're implementing, we have at least one example to illustrate that rule. So that way we can say that we have coverage of at least a test in each sort of piece of business logic we're implementing. So this is a good measure of coverage if we want to look at one. Another is the effective automation. So we take a look at all of the examples that we've created for that user story, And we want to take a look at the number of cases that have been automated over the candidate test cases. Because again, not every example can be or should be automated, but we want to at least capture what degree of coverage we have over the candidate number of test cases. This gives us a good indication of how much technical debt we have accrued from the quality standpoint, because if we have good candidate test cases and we have not automated those, then we have gaps in our coverage that we either are going to have to test manually or we're just going to have to assume that risk. So this is another good measure of our progress. And I would say, for whatever project tracking tool you're using, if you identify those examples and capture them in the tool and you miss out on automating some of those, hey, you've at least made it transparent that you have accrued technical debt. So you can identify those as action items for the teams to pick up. So I have included a link to the presentation on SlideShare. I'm going to stay on the slide for a while for folks to do a little screen capture of it or type it in if you want that long secret there. So it's the same presentation I'm giving today. So I have a couple different forms of this because some of these have been given in workshop style. I open it up for any questions that people may have via the chat, or if we allow unmuting, I'm not sure if we do in here, I'm more than happy to answer.
Great. All right, thank you so much, Thomas. Well, while we finish up, like you said, certainly if we have questions, please feel free. You can raise your hand or also type in the Q&A either way. And yeah, thank you so much, Thomas. I think that was a really excellent presentation. All the guidance and the importance of collaboration and having a common standard. A really great analogy on user story, rules, and examples, as well as all the useful metrics. A lot of really great information.
Thank you, appreciate it. And for the folks attending, this is set up so that if you wanted to try it out within your team or your company, you're more than welcome to use this at will. So I highly recommend doing the Hollywood blockbuster example to get people thinking outside of the box on rules and examples before you bring it to something that they're totally familiar with, because we have a habit of bringing in our own biases when discussing these things.
Absolutely. Very great point. Okay, great. Well, thank you again. I think everyone likely learned a lot from your presentation today and the information that you linked to. And thank you to everyone for joining us. We hold many other informative events, upcoming DCCAP E-Summit on that, as well as any other events on our website, which is dccap.com/events.
Excellent, thank you.
And
It looks like we do have one question. So I'm seeing Zohil, in a startup scenario where no requirement or user stories have been defined, but the product is live, how would you advise QA to approach test scripting in BDD format? So that is an excellent question. And in fact, a couple months ago, I had a similar experience of you. There was a product that they had pretty much no documentation around from a testing standpoint. It was more of like, just validate that these pages are working and the elements are present. So those are very like low level validations. So what I would recommend is what we did, which is we go to our business partners. We say, all right, how is this application going to be used? What are the valuable flows in terms of like the how-tos for how the users are going to interact with the system? We started there of working with our business partners, how the system is actually going to be used as they saw it by the end users. And they ended up actually having a lot of how-to documentation around it for different cases for someone, say like, in this case, this is about engagement for brand new customers. And so based upon the business described flows, we then were able to create a number of user stories in a BDD format because it matched the user behavior, and that became the initial regression. And then once that product was live, we got to see, all right, other areas of need, as in from the analytics, we could actually make judgment on how the users were interacting with the system that was different than what was expected. from the open defects that were filed. We could then create more test coverage around that once fixing the defects. And in this way, we've slowly built up a good regression from the state of having pretty much nothing present, for a live product. So I hope that helps. It just focus on that user behavior as the first and foremost, and then get on to those, sort of smaller, sort of superficial validations as needed later.
Great. Awesome. All right. And Zahil, thanks you as well. All right. Doesn't look like any other questions are coming in. So again, thank you so much, Thomas, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it. Take care, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
It's a pleasure. Everyone.